Big day for me. So Katy George is going to come back to the stage to lead a conversation with Kurt Strovink, a senior partner at McKinsey and co-author of the book, The Journey of Leadership, How CEOs Learn to Lead from the Inside Out, which McKinsey has generously gifted to everyone in person today. Also joining the conversation, Clive Gillinson, Executive and Artistic Director of Carnegie Hall. So please welcome to the stage, Katy, Kurt, and Clive.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Excellent. Well, it's wonderful to be here with my former colleague, Kurt, and also with Clive. And actually, Clive, I just learned that it is opening night at Carnegie Hall. So this is a rather big day.
So if I start talking about the concert tonight, don't worry.
And you said it's the biggest opening night you've ever had.
It is. Yeah.
Amazing. And the program is?
Well, tonight it's Gustavo Dudamel, the Los Angeles Philharmonic, Lang Lang, and the opening of our tribute to Latin American music.
Amazing, amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking time to be here today. Kurt is one of the preeminent CEO counselors at McKinsey and has just co-authored this book about how CEOs learn to lead from the inside out. And Kurt, maybe you could start by just talking a little bit about where did this book come from? Was it some academic bit of research, or what was the basis for the thinking?
Yeah, it actually grew out of something we have and have been doing for about 10 years or so called the Bauer Forum, which is a group of small, close-knit group of CEOs that come together for 2.5 days, which we orchestrate and help. And really, they learn from each other. And it is a group of sort of 4 or 5 in number over the 2.5 days. And we've been doing this for 10 years. And so it's probably a basis of about 500 people at this point who've gone through this. And this book is basically a synthesis of sort of the leadership journey from those folks as they interacted with each other, as they challenged each other, as they kept in touch with each other, not just on the 2.5 days, but afterwards. And one of the things that struck us from these stories was that about 70% of the things that they talked about and worked with each other around were actually human-centric leadership aspects. They weren't the technocratic aspects of leadership, as important as those may be. They were actually things around how to interact with the board, how to work with somebody that was a complicated presence on the senior team, or how to connect with stakeholders naturally, or how to work in other ways on themselves as leaders as they were trying to do things and have the energy and fortitude to keep leading. So it was around those human-centric elements. It was based on the data set of 500. I would say it's like a laboratory of leadership at the CEO level, but it's meant for leadership for everybody. That's what I would say is where the book came from.
Thank you. One of the things that I actually was surprised as I got into it is that a lot of what you talk about are some of the limiting mindsets that CEOs have. And you kind of think that when somebody finally makes it to CEO, they've kind of got stuff figured out. And yet you talk about CEOs who have imposter syndrome. You talk about CEOs who talk too much and don't listen enough, who aren't creating the right opportunities for others. So and I assume that that's what you mean about learning to lead from the inside out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, yes, absolutely. I think the concept is we came to this idea, and it's not as if nobody has ever talked about this before, but we just saw it in sort of technicolor through these stories of how so much of the inner journey is a sort of a predicate to being able to lead people externally. And so you have to kind of learn to lead yourself before you can lead others, or lead others at the best level possible. And so many of the stories of things people were struggling with externally trace to things that they were working on internally. And that's why we talked about the inner game. And that's true even for CEOs, as you point out, who could have a point of arrival. In fact, it almost led us to kind of a definition of modern leadership. And this isn't fully in the book, but it's just something that we've been thinking about additionally, which is that leadership starts to happen when you're responsible for that you can't fully control. And there's that tension in leadership where it's almost an emotional tension. You feel responsible for outcomes that you can't completely determine yourself. And we think that that's felt acutely by CEOs, but it's also felt by many other leaders. And part of what we've been thinking about is how do you negotiate those polarities, that tension? And the book is about how do you negotiate those different things, stories of others who've done that. And so it talks about, for example, Stefan Bonsall and his leadership that was quite courageous for Moderna at a particular point in time when he was trying to get to 1 billion doses, for the world, and how important that was, and the boldness with which he set the vision. In fact, there was a time where he confronted his head of R&D and said, we need to get 1 billion doses. And the head of R&D said, there's just no way we're going to be able to do that. And he said, let me rephrase politely. What do you need for us to be able to get to 1 billion doses? And he was an example of boldness and empowerment. There's another story about Wendy Kopp in the book that's about how she, having built Teach for America, which is an amazing organization, she actually wanted to go global and build Teach for All, as many of you might know. And she had to release her understanding of what worked in the US context in Teach for America in order to make this work in India and many other countries around the world. But she went through a personal journey to release the idea that she had figured it out and had a method in the US. It wasn't easy. And how did she do that? How did she get to the point where she could empower others? And that's another story in the book. So there's many different examples, but they all have to do with the way that leader was grappling with things inside themselves, often shadows of strengths and not just limiting mindsets. But then how they became better acquainted with those things, maybe overcame those or added to their game a little bit, and then that helped them lead in other ways. So that's a little bit of the sort of thesis throughout.
That's great. Clive, I'd love to hear a little bit about your leadership journey. Are there things that you had to release or that you had to change in your own mindset as you've taken on this unbelievable institution?
Well, I think just worth going a little bit back to the beginning, only in as much as I never was interested in being a leader. And I never was even interested in running a music institution of any sort. I was originally going to be a mathematician or a musician. In the end, having made a false start in math, which I just realized I didn't want to do after all, became a cellist in the London Symphony Orchestra. The orchestra got into financial trouble at a new concert hall, and they couldn't find a manager. So they thought they'd get a player to go in temporarily. I mean, just because it was my orchestra, I'd been playing for 12 years in it. When they asked me, I mean, I couldn't understand why they'd asked me in the first place because I had no background, but none of us did in management. I must have been last out of the room or something. But whatever it was, they asked me to do it for 3 months. At the end of 3 months, they couldn't find a manager. And they offered it to me, and I said no, because after 3 months, you cannot tell if I'm the right person, and I have no idea if I want to do it. I've never wanted to be a manager. So I agreed that I'd do it for a year. They'd keep my cello job open. So the interesting thing, and after a year, they did offer it to me again, and I did it for 21 years before being headhunted for this job here. So, in a way, I haven't defined any of my own life. Which I think is actually quite important. And one of the very first things I learned, because when you go into a job like that, where you know nothing, and everybody's coming to you for answers immediately, all you can do is try and ask the best questions. And that, to me, questions are more important than answers, is actually been one of the premises of all management for me. And funnily enough, one of the best examples was shortly after I came to Carnegie Hall, where one of our most powerful trustees said, I think we should do this project. It's incredible, et cetera, et cetera. I thought it was a terrible idea, but I didn't know how to deal with that. I talked to the senior team. We all thought it was a terrible idea, but we thought, America being America, if it's somebody who's giving a huge amount of money, if I say I think it's a bad idea, that's probably my flight back to England. So I thought, how do I deal with this? And I went to the chairman and I said, this has been proposed, and should I come up with all the questions we have to answer if we're going to do it? And he said, fine, okay. So we got together, we mapped out all the answers, all the questions, and then I sent them to the chairman. And when I walked in the door, he said to me, Clive, we're not doing that project, are we? And so the questions had solved it. I didn't actually have to tell him anything. The questions had done it. So, I mean, it's been a big part. Obviously I've had to learn every aspect of management, but handling how you work with artists, where artists have their own incredibly strong views. But on the other hand, you've got to lead them. They don't understand the audience in the given places where you're going. Also, some artists want to be very conservative. Other artists want to be too innovative. And nobody will want to go to their concerts. So you've got to find the way of getting the really innovative ones to do something that challenges the audience, that creates journeys of exploration and discovery, but at the same time is something you think you can find a way to sell. And equally, the ones who are very conservative, you have to encourage them to be more innovative and explore a bit more. So the whole of this journey it's very different from running a business. I always think Steve Jobs, who, when he created the iPhone, he wasn't thinking, how do I make money? He was thinking, how do I serve people? Our whole job is to serve people with music and transform lives through music. But at the end of the day, you've actually got to come up with something not that works and therefore you repeat it endlessly, because all we do is Beethoven cycles. You've got to come up with something all the time that is absolutely captivating for audiences, but at the same time encourages them to explore and grow and ask questions and develop. And so it's a fascinating journey in that way for how you work with people to do something where you're leading them to do something you utterly believe in, that somehow personifies them, because nobody comes to a concert hall to hear what Clive Gillinson thinks. They come to a concert hall to hear what Gustavo Dudamel or Lang Lang or all the greatest artists, to hear what they believe in. So how do you lead them to fulfill their beliefs in a way that is something that is utterly compelling, but exploratory and challenges in every way that's important?
It's interesting because I think that you've just described, what most leaders' task is, which is how do you challenge, the employees who are a little conservative to think more, and how do you challenge the innovative ones to, really think about connecting with a customer and a customer need. So I think that's wonderful. Who are your influencers in terms of leadership? And Kurt told me that you've been quite influenced by some conductors. And I think that's fascinating to think about the conductor as an example of leadership that might apply in your executive role.
Well, it's very interesting. Conductors have traced a very similar path to executives. When you think back 50, 60 years, the leaders used to be, I think, what you call in the book, the imperial executive. And I have to say, I thought the book was fantastic and really interesting. So they, and a lot of them used to think you lead through fear, and they would try to terrify orchestras. And that was really the world I came into as a player. And bit by bit, it's evolved, as has leadership in business, towards people who believe that you want to take everybody with you, that the only way is to see your team as a resource, and how do you use that resource in the best possible way, so that what you've got, your skill base, is the combination of all of you. It's not just what the leader thinks or does. So how you lead people, I mean, in some ways, for me, one of the greatest helps was going from being a player to manager and knowing nothing. Because it meant the London Symphony Orchestra is owned by the players. So it's a little bit like a cooperative. So the point was I had to take everybody with me. I couldn't tell anybody to do anything. And so I learned from the very, very beginning that if you're going to take people on a journey, and there were huge things that had to change, but if you're going to take them on a journey, you've got to, often through asking questions, you've got to get them to look at things in a different way, look at the long term rather than the short term, because musicians tend to look at my short term gain. If I'm going to earn more money tomorrow, this is really what I want to do. Whereas if you want to really go for quality, you have to make compromises in the short term and look at long term goals. So all of this, getting people to ask those questions of themselves, was one of the biggest challenges. But it was actually my fortune, really, in a way, that I had no choice. Because I knew nothing. And there's a great advantage in knowing nothing.
I love it. That's a good quote. Kurt, I'd love for you to reflect on how that, relates to CEOs in the business context. This morning, actually, as we opened the conference, Edith, who's there, actually said, leaders in the future, or leaders now, are called to be even more kind of humble listeners, enabling, empowering others. And that might be something we talked about before, but now it's really required because of the volatility of the world, changing expectations of workforce. How do you see that playing out, Kurt, in terms of your CEO counseling and what you guys saw in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I think this, this journey or this movement from being more directive and maybe an imperial CEO to being more inclusive and leading through others, and for that to be a real skill, I think is both on the rise and is important and will continue to. I do think it's also still important to set the context for collective action and to be somebody who's in the business of setting those parameters. And so I don't think that's as delegatable or group consensus as it might seem always. I mean, certainly inputs matter, but I think for some of the most senior folks in organizations, I often think of them as they are chief calibration officers. They have to decide how fast do we need to move and with what extent? And that question of how fast and what extent isn't really delegatable. I think within that, the problem solving, given that ambition, is highly, I think, inclusive ideally in strong leaders. But I do think there's this role for leaders to decide, are we moving fast enough? Are we moving, are we moving with enough magnitude? And I often see that CEOs that do that well and then also empower and create leadership inside of that set of parameters that they set do particularly well. But if they abandon the set of parameters and it's a Ouija board or a set of hands around the table, it's hard to elect and through democracy into winning strategies and execution paths, I think. But it's a mixture. It's this delicate balance between how do you maybe, and those conditions that you set are not just divinely inspired or something. They're through the conversations with folks. But I do think they need to put their finger on the scales in that way.
And how important is clarity of purpose in that
I think
recipe?
Vital. I think vital. I think it's vital both because it's where energy stems from for many, especially talent-rich organizations. I think it aligns organizations better. People have to have a view of why we're here. I sometimes have talked about this 4 W's approach, who, why, what, when. And there are a lot of leaders who power past the first 2 W's to focus on the last 2, what we should be doing and when we should be doing it. And they underinvest in why we're here and who we are. And I think those leaders that balance the investment across those 4 create this powerful energy in organizations to achieve things when people buy in and believe those. And oftentimes those questions of who we are not just emanating from one person, but they're discussions and dialogues. They usually reach back into the history of organizations. They look forward in the future. They have a proprietary view of how the 2 link. I mean, there's some richness in how those are developed, I think, for change. But ideally, you get a group of people that are emotionally committed, invested in these outcomes. They're talented in other ways, and you get even more energy for your strategy and other things. So, but I do think it's really important to align organizations through purpose. And without that, I think we're all working extremely hard, and so there's an exhaustion factor that overwhelms the to-do list.
How have you thought about purpose and the role at Carnegie Hall?
Well, for me, values are the fundamental thing. They underpin everything. But then purpose and mission are absolutely vital. And I mean, just an interesting example for me was when I arrived at Carnegie Hall, almost the first question that people would ask at some point in every single meeting was, what is best for Carnegie Hall? And I always said, it's the wrong question. There's only one question, which is, how does Carnegie Hall serve people through music? If we answer that question, we will ultimately do what is best for Carnegie Hall. And everything comes out of that. I mean, Muhammad Yunus, who probably a lot of you know of, who is somebody I admire enormously, he always said, the first question you ask defines your journey. And I think he's 100% right. And for us, I won't allow anybody to ask what is best for Carnegie Hall, because it doesn't matter. It's not about the institution. It's how the institution serves people through music. And so creating that culture within an organization is fundamental. And therefore, if you first ask the right question, you will define a completely different path than if you ask for what is best for Carnegie Hall. So, I mean, purpose is utterly fundamental, and it defines your path from the very first question.
And that's a great example, by the way, of Clive setting a parameter, right? He will stop the conversation if. There are a few things like that, I think, back to your earlier question, that are important to have in the equation.
Kurt, I was going to end with, you are a great teacher of kind of the art of CEO counseling at McKinsey. Tell us a little about what, many people in this room are in roles where they are supporting senior executives and trying to help them be most effective. What are your tips for how to do that effectively? What is the craft of counseling a CEO?
Well, I would first, humbly say, I think we're all learning. And I think the most important thing is a learning mindset at all times, with, building and learning from other people, and also learning from the people you're counseling or have an opportunity to do that. I think, obviously building trust is fundamental, and that comes in different ways. And all of you, no doubt, have built trust with executives and CEOs in particular. I do think, though, that sort of you can play a conciliary role as senior people leaders or CHROs or others in a way that probably few can't, because you're looking at some of these human dimensions that we're talking about here. And I think there's many different ways in which that plays out. Some of it is paying attention to, does the CEO have a story and a purpose, and some of the things we talked about, and is that something can be summarized in 10 seconds? And does it have proprietary vocabulary around it so that it's theirs, or something that, allows the firm or the organization to really believe in something that has some uniqueness? And I think oftentimes folks in this room will play a key role in shaping that story, or saying, I heard you say this in this meeting, or that in this meeting, or those two things together are powerful. Have you ever thought about that? We should use that more broadly. I think being attentive to language frames and things that are better synthesis of why we're here and what we're doing, and what we need to do is one area. I think, and listening to the way they think and the way they speak and the words, and making sure that you're dialed into making that something authentic that they can communicate, not just talking points from communications that they may or may not have a unique role in creating. So I think figuring out their voice and projecting that is something that many people in this room can do. I think there's also working through others. That's an art, and counseling your CEOs on how to lead through others without constantly giving feedback in every interaction, but having insight into what makes people tick, other people in the executive team. How do you create not just a team of all-stars, but an all-star team? That's a different thing. Like, how do you coach into that? What are your observations that would help people achieve that? I think that's a second. And then I do think, or at least we're trying to expose, and the reason we wrote the book was we wanted a broader conversation to happen around this. There is this inner game, and and this is a sacred space. People don't always admit you into like what they're struggling with. But I think that as you lead at the highest levels in people, you'll probably find yourself in moments where you can help them with the inner game in one way or the other. Probably strength-based coaching, probably pointing some things out, connecting things over time, or pointing out that something was not effective. But that'll depend on the relationship when you can do that. But I think looking for opportunities and imagining that external leadership traces to internal, you may have a better ringside seat and view of that than many other people, and therefore be able to help more. Those would be a couple things.
Thank you. I think everyone will enjoy reading and really learning more about the inner game, because I think that is really what's very unique about this book. So thank you for being here. And Clive, thank you so much for sharing your philosophy of leadership. I found that very inspiring, and we wish you the best for tonight. Break a leg.